I asked for a 3% raise after 9 years with the company. 3%. Not a promotion. Not a bonus. Not equity. Just enough to keep up with inflation. My boss laughed. Not an awkward chuckle. Not a nervous smile. He leaned back in his chair, actually burst into laughter, slapped his desk once and said, "Go whine somewhere else, Melody." That was the exact moment everything changed. Until then, I had believed loyalty still meant something. My name is Melody. I'm 38 years old, and at that point, I had spent nearly a decade working for Northline Systems, a mid-sized logistics software company in Chicago. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't loud, but I was dependable. The person everyone went to when something broke 5 minutes before a client deadline. I joined Northline when it was still scrappy, back when we shared one conference room and the CEO brought his own coffee mug. Over the years, I helped build internal tools, train new hires, fix legacy systems no one else wanted to touch, and quietly became the person who knew how everything actually worked. My performance reviews were always the same. Exceeds expectations. Critical to operations. Strong institutional knowledge. My salary, however, barely moved, so when annual reviews came around that spring, I did my homework. I pulled market data. I printed my metrics. I listed projects I had led, systems I maintained, outages I prevented. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't demanding. I asked for 3%. My manager, Greg, didn't even look at the papers. He skimmed the first page, leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and laughed like I'd just told a joke at happy hour. 3%, he said. Then louder, like he wanted the hallway to hear, "Melody, come on, go whine somewhere else." I remember sitting there, hands folded in my lap, feeling something very specific settle in my chest. Not anger, not embarrassment, clarity. Because when someone shows you exactly how little they respect you, the confusion disappears. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, "All right, thank you for your time." That surprised him more than if I had yelled. He waved me off, already swiveling back to his screen. "Close the door on your way out." I did. At my desk, the office felt louder than usual. Keyboards clacking, Slack notifications chiming, someone laughing near the break room. All of it suddenly felt distant, like I was watching a place I no longer belonged to. I finished the day professionally. I answered messages. I closed tickets. I fixed a production issue no one else could figure out. Then I went home and did something I hadn't done in 9 years. I opened my resume. Not out of spite. Out of self-respect. I updated it carefully. Not exaggerating. Not underselling. Just facts. Years of experience. Systems I had architected. Clients whose platforms I quietly kept running. I wasn't desperate. I still had a job. But Greg had made something very clear. There was no future for me at Northline. That evening, I remembered a name I hadn't thought about in a while. Daniel Ross. He used to work at Northline years ago before leaving for Apex Dynamics, Northline's biggest competitor. Back then, everyone said he'd made a risky move. Apex had since doubled in size. I still had his number. I stared at my phone for a long moment before calling. Not rehearsing. Not panicking. Just breathing. When he picked up, his voice was warm. "Melody? Wow, it's been years." We talked briefly. Caught up. Nothing dramatic. Then he asked casually, "So, how's life at Northline?" I paused. "Honestly," I said, "I think it's time for a change." There was a beat of silence. Not awkward, interested. "Well," Daniel said slowly, "that's interesting timing." That was all he said. No promises, no pitch. But before hanging up, he added, "Send me your resume. Just send it." I did. I went to bed that night calmer than I'd felt in months. Because for the first time, I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I was exploring options. Greg thought I'd go whine somewhere else. He had no idea how literally I was about to take that advice. I didn't tell anyone at work about the call with Daniel. The next morning, I walked into Northline exactly the same way I always had. Badge in, coffee in hand, nodding at people I'd worked beside for nearly a decade. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Internally, something had loosened. A pressure I hadn't realized I was carrying. I wasn't planning an exit yet. I wasn't burning bridges. I was simply observing. That day alone, 3 different people came to my desk with problems that technically weren't mine anymore. 2 years earlier, Greg had reassigned half my responsibilities without adjusting my title or pay. The work never disappeared. It just came back in the form of quick questions and, "Can you take a look at this?" I took a look. I always did. By lunchtime, I'd already prevented a configuration error that would have caused a client outage. Greg never knew. He rarely did. Problems didn't reach him because I intercepted them before they exploded. That afternoon, I received an email from Daniel. Subject line: "Good to hear from you." It wasn't a job offer. It wasn't even formal. He thanked me for sending my resume and said he'd shared it with their director of engineering. He asked if I'd be open to a conversation later in the week. Nothing official, just a discussion. I replied, yes. Not excited. Not nervous. Just honest. The rest of the week unfolded like a case study in quiet dependence. On Wednesday, Greg called an impromptu meeting to address performance concerns after a missed internal deadline. The room filled with engineers, project managers, and one visibly stressed junior developer who had inherited a system I'd originally built. Greg stood at the front, arms crossed. "We need accountability," he said, eyes scanning the room until they landed on the junior dev. "Deadlines matter." I spoke up, not to defend myself, but to correct the narrative. "That delay wasn't a performance issue," I said calmly. "The deployment failed because the database migration script was outdated. I flagged that last quarter." Greg frowned. "We're not rehashing old tickets, Melody." I nodded. "Then we'll see the same issue again." Silence. The meeting ended awkwardly. Later that afternoon, Greg stopped by my desk. "You didn't need to undermine me in front of the team," he said quietly. "I wasn't undermining you," I replied. "I was preventing a recurring problem." He stared at me for a moment, then scoffed. "You're getting sensitive lately." That word, sensitive, landed heavier than he realized, because sensitivity wasn't the issue. Visibility was. That evening, I joined a video call with Daniel and 2 people from Apex, their engineering director and a senior product lead. The conversation felt different, focused, respectful. They asked specific questions about systems, about scalability, about how I handled failures. No one interrupted me. No one laughed. When I explained how I'd maintained legacy systems while onboarding new architecture at Northline, the director leaned forward. "Why isn't this documented internally?" he asked. "It is," I said. "It just doesn't get read." They exchanged glances. By the end of the call, Daniel said, "We'd like to continue this conversation. Would you be open to an in-person meeting?" I said yes. At Northline, the tone around me began to shift, though no one said anything directly. Greg became more curt. My calendar invites grew thinner. Decisions I'd normally be looped into were suddenly made without me. It was subtle, plausible, the kind of distancing that leaves no paper trail. On Friday, I overheard Greg talking to HR near the printer. "She's been checked out lately," he said, not as engaged. I didn't confront him. I didn't react. Instead, I documented everything. Not emotionally, professionally. Dates, conversations, project ownership changes, decision exclusions. Years of experience had taught me one thing. When a workplace dynamic shifts suddenly, it's rarely accidental. The following Monday, Apex flew me out. No luxury, no theatrics, just a straightforward itinerary and a day of meetings. I toured their offices, spoke with teams, reviewed systems. They weren't perfect. No company is. But they were growing. And more importantly, they were listening. That afternoon, their director of engineering walked me to a quiet conference room. "Melody," he said, "I'm going to be direct. You're operating 2 levels below where you should be." I didn't argue. He slid a folder across the table. "We'd like to make you an offer." I didn't open it right away, because back at Northline, Greg still thought I'd gone to Whine somewhere else. And very soon, he was going to realize just how badly he'd underestimated where that whining led. I didn't open the folder immediately. That wasn't a tactic. It was instinct. Years of corporate life had trained me to pause before reacting, to read the room before reading the paper. The director of engineering, Mark, sat across from me, hands folded, expression neutral but attentive. This wasn't a pressure play. It was the opposite. "Take your time," he said. "We're not in a rush." That alone told me everything I needed to know. I opened the folder carefully. The number on the page made my breath catch. Not because it was flashy, but because it was fair. More than fair. The base salary alone was nearly 3 times what I was currently making. On top of that, a performance bonus, a clear title that matched my responsibilities, and equity that vested over 4 years. No inflated promises. No vague language. Just clarity. I asked practical questions about expectations, about reporting structure, about work-life balance. They answered every one directly. When I asked how they evaluated performance, Mark didn't hesitate. "Outcomes," he said, "and documentation. If something breaks, we fix it. If someone raises a concern, we track it." I thought of Greg waving me off in his office. When the meeting ended, Daniel walked me to the elevator. "We're excited," he said, "but I know this is a big decision." "It is," I replied honestly. "I don't make quick moves." He smiled. "That's part of why we want you." On the flight home, I didn't feel giddy. I felt grounded. I read the offer again, line by line, making notes in the margins. This wasn't an escape fantasy. It was a professional transition. Back at Northline, the week unfolded with increasing friction. Greg scheduled a one-on-one with me for the first time in months. When I walked into his office, he didn't ask me to sit. "I've been getting feedback," he said, arms crossed, "that you're disengaged." I met his gaze. "From whom?" He hesitated. "That's not the point." "It is," I said calmly. "If there are concerns about my performance, I'd like specifics." He sighed, clearly irritated. "You're not being a team player lately?" I almost laughed, but didn't. "I've met every deadline," I said. "Resolved every escalation, documented every issue. If that's not teamwork, I'm not sure what is." Greg leaned forward. "Look, Melody, you asked for a raise we couldn't justify. That should have told you where things stand." There it was. I nodded once. "Thank you for clarifying." That seemed to unsettle him. "Are you looking elsewhere?" he asked suddenly. I didn't lie. I didn't confirm. "I'm evaluating my options," I said. His jaw tightened. "You'd be making a mistake." I left the office without responding. That afternoon, HR emailed me about a role realignment. My responsibilities were being reassigned to 2 less experienced employees to encourage cross-functional growth. No mention of my input. No transition plan. It was a slow push toward the edge. I spent that evening reviewing Apex's offer with a trusted employment attorney. She flagged nothing concerning. In fact, she noted how unusually clean it was. "They want you long-term," she said. "This isn't a bait and switch." 2 days later, Apex sent a revised offer, slightly improved, without me asking. That was when I decided. I didn't resign immediately. Instead, I prepared. I finalized documentation, updated system diagrams, cleaned up repositories. I left nothing ambiguous. If I was leaving, it would be professionally. Greg, however, sensed the shift. He stopped copying me on emails. He reassigned meetings. He made passive comments and stand-ups about commitment and loyalty. I said nothing. Then, on Friday afternoon, he called me into his office again. "I heard through the grapevine," he said, smirking, "that Apex has been sniffing around." I raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting." "You should be careful," he continued. "People who jump ship don't always land on their feet." I smiled politely. "I appreciate the concern." He leaned back, confident. "Just remember, Northline made you." That night, I signed Apex's offer. The confirmation email arrived within minutes, welcoming me aboard, outlining next steps and setting a start date 3 weeks out. I closed my laptop and sat quietly. Greg thought he held the power. He had no idea that by laughing at a 3% raise, he'd pushed me directly into a position where his leverage over me was already gone. And soon the consequences wouldn't just affect me. I submitted my resignation on a Tuesday morning. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just a formal email to HR, Greg, and his manager, giving 2 weeks' notice as required by my contract. The subject line was simple: notice of resignation. I was halfway through my coffee when Greg appeared at my desk. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice tight. I nodded and followed him into his office. This time, he gestured for me to sit. "You're really leaving," he said, as if saying it out loud might change something. "Yes." "For Apex?" he asked. "I'm not discussing details," I replied evenly. He exhaled sharply. "You realize you're putting us in a tough spot." I almost corrected him, but didn't. "That wasn't my intention," I said, "but my decision is final." He stared at me for a long moment, then leaned forward. "We can revisit compensation." I waited. "How much?" I asked. He hesitated. "Well, maybe 5%. 6 if we can get approval." I didn't respond right away. "Greg," I said finally, "you laughed when I asked for 3. His face flushed. "That was a misunderstanding." "No," I said calmly. "It was clarity." I stood. "I'll support a smooth transition over the next 2 weeks." As I walked out, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. The next few days were chaos. The 2 employees who had inherited my responsibilities quickly realized they didn't have the access, or the context, to manage the systems I oversaw. Tickets piled up. Deployments stalled. A client escalated an issue directly to senior leadership after a reporting dashboard failed during a quarterly review. Suddenly, my calendar filled again. Greg stopped by my desk constantly, asking quick questions that were anything but quick. I answered professionally, but I documented everything. By Thursday, the director of operations requested a meeting. "Melody," she said carefully, "we're concerned about continuity." "I understand," I replied. "Is there any chance you'd consider staying on longer? As a consultant?" I shook my head. "I've accepted another role." She nodded, clearly frustrated, but not with me. That afternoon, Apex announced a new enterprise partnership with Northline's largest client. The news spread fast. Slack channels lit up. Executives scrambled. Greg stormed past my desk without looking at me. By Friday morning, Northline's leadership called an emergency meeting with the technical teams. I was invited. Greg wasn't leading it. The VP of engineering stood at the front, visibly stressed. "We're experiencing resource gaps," he said. "We need full transparency on system dependencies." I spoke when asked. Factually, calmly, no embellishment, no blame. After the meeting, the VP pulled me aside. "Why wasn't I aware of how much you were handling?" he asked quietly. "I documented it," I said. "It's all in the internal wiki." He sighed. "I'll review it." Greg didn't speak to me for the rest of the day. The following Monday, HR requested an exit interview earlier than scheduled. The tone was different, more careful. "Would you be open to delaying your departure by a month?" the HR manager asked. "We're prepared to offer additional compensation." I declined. By midweek, word reached me, unofficially, that Apex had recruited 2 more Northline engineers. Greg's team, engineers he'd dismissed as replaceable. The tension in the office was palpable. Meetings grew shorter, conversations quieter, people avoided eye contact. On my final day, Greg called me into his office one last time. He didn't sit. "You planned this," he said flatly. I met his gaze. "I planned my career." You laughed. He scoffed. "You think Apex won't treat you the same?" "I don't know," I said honestly, but they didn't start by mocking me. There was nothing else to say. I packed my desk, lighter than it had been in years, and walked out with a polite goodbye to colleagues who suddenly seemed unsure whether to congratulate or apologize. 2 weeks later, I started at Apex. On my first day, I was given access, authority, and a clear mandate. 3 days in, I learned that Northline had missed a major delivery deadline. A week later, their stock dipped after losing another client. Greg's name appeared on an internal restructuring memo. I didn't celebrate, but I didn't feel guilty either, because I hadn't sabotaged anything. I had simply gone somewhere that valued what Northline had taken for granted, and Greg was about to learn the difference between losing an employee and losing the person who quietly held everything together. 3 months after I left Northline, the noise finally settled enough for patterns to become clear. From the outside, it looked like a normal corporate transition. A few press releases, a quiet restructuring. Leadership changes framed as strategic realignment. Inside the industry, though, people understood exactly what had happened. At Apex, my role expanded quickly, but not chaotically. I was brought in to stabilize systems, document risk, and build processes that didn't rely on institutional memory living inside one person's head. The irony wasn't lost on me. On my second month, I was invited to sit in on a client call. Not as support, but as lead. The same client Northline had lost weeks after my departure. They didn't ask about Northline directly. They didn't need to. They asked about continuity, about reliability, about whether Apex planned to grow responsibly or burn out chasing margins. I answered honestly. After the call, Daniel smiled. "You see why they wanted you?" I did. Meanwhile, news from Northline filtered in through former colleagues and industry contacts. The kind of information that never appears on LinkedIn. Greg had been reassigned, then quietly let go. Not for my resignation, not officially, for failure to anticipate operational risk. The phrase made me pause when I first heard it, because I had anticipated it. I'd documented it, flagged it, tried to prevent it. But Greg had mistaken confidence for control, and laughter for authority. Northline didn't collapse. Companies rarely do all at once, but they shrank. Slowly, expensively. Clients grew cautious. Talent stopped applying. Institutional knowledge leaked out one resignation at a time. Apex, on the other hand, grew. Not explosively, sustainably. 6 months in, I received my first performance review. It was direct, specific, fair, and followed by a compensation adjustment, without me asking. That was when it fully sank in. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about respect. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email from Greg. The subject line read, "Checking in." I stared at it longer than I expected before opening it. The message was brief, awkward, carefully worded. He congratulated me on my new role. Said he'd heard I was doing well. Mentioned that he was exploring new opportunities and wondered if I might be open to a quick call to catch up. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, out of closure, because I had nothing left to explain. At Apex, I was asked to mentor a junior engineer who reminded me of myself years ago. Capable, quiet, underestimated. During one of our sessions, she hesitated before asking a question. "Can I be honest?" she said. "Always." "I struggle with asking for more," she admitted. "I don't want to seem difficult." I smiled gently. "Let me tell you something I learned the hard way." And I told her, not the whole story, but enough. About knowing your value. about documentation, about not mistaking tolerance for loyalty, and about laughter. Anyone can laugh at a request, I said. Pay attention to who listens instead. That night, driving home, I thought about that meeting, months ago now, when I'd asked for 3%. Such a small number. Such a large consequence. Greg had laughed because he thought I had nowhere else to go. What he never understood was that competence creates options quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't threaten. It just waits. A year after leaving Northline, I received an industry award, not for innovation, but for operational excellence. The kind of recognition that doesn't trend online but changes careers. At the ceremony, someone asked me if my story was one of revenge. I shook my head. No, I said. It's a story about alignment. Revenge implies intent to harm. I never wanted to hurt Greg. Or Northline. I simply stopped protecting a place that refused to protect me. And when I went somewhere that valued my work, the consequences took care of themselves. That's the part people often miss. You don't have to destroy anyone. Sometimes all you have to do is leave and let the truth become visible in your absence. Greg laughed at a 3% raise. I didn't argue. I just went somewhere else. And in doing so, I learned something I wish I'd known years earlier. The most expensive mistake a manager can make isn't underpaying someone. It's underestimating what happens when they finally stop asking.